right, everything you need to know about the difference between global warming and ozone depletion. Starting off with global warming causes, we've got cows. That's a big one from all the methane that they produce. Consumption of fossil fuels, also a big one. Fossil fuels. Indirectly from fossil fuels, we have the generation of electricity, except for nuclear power, because nuclear power doesn't produce any of these greenhouse gases that we're concerned about. So make a note, not nuclear. We have landfills because those produce a lot of methane. And then we have rice production. Most agriculture in general, but rice in particular, because it also makes use of those hypoxic anaerobic conditions, because rice grows underwater. So for chemicals involved, when we say greenhouse gases, the one we're talking about is water vapor. Now, this is a natural greenhouse gas. This one is going to happen with or without human interference, and it is the most abundant, meaning the most common. Then we have our nitrogen oxides, NOxes. We have CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, methane, now methane in particular, there's only a little bit of it, but it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. So it's small, but strong. Whereas carbon dioxide, that's the diva that gets all the attention, is weak, but there's lots of it. The layer of the atmosphere that's being affected is the troposphere. That's the layer closest to the surface of the Earth. That's where we live. That's where our weather is found. So our environmental effects, we have melting ice, both in the sea and the land. We have the increase in extreme weather events. That's not how you spell weather. We have floods, especially in coastal areas. A big one, we have thermal expansion of ocean water. That's what contributes the most to sea levels rising, not melting ice. Melting ice definitely doesn't help, but the majority of ocean sea levels rising is caused by the thermal expansion of ocean water. Okay. Human health effects. Here there's a lot. College Board enjoys asking about these as well. First, you have the increased range for vectors of spreading disease, like insects. It's now warm and wet enough for insects to live further away from the poles than they ever have before. So now you have those insect-borne diseases that need to be dealt with in areas that has never had to deal with it before. You end up with tropical diseases in areas that weren't necessarily tropical before. You have a loss of crops. Areas where you could grow certain crops before are now either too warm, or crops that require the cold need to move further away from the equator, closer to the poles. So that loss of crops means that human health is impacted. Now you don't have enough calories for people. You have issues of malnutrition and undernutrition increasing. And then finally you have things like heat stroke. Particularly the elderly and the very small are more susceptible to changes in temperature. So you have an increase in things like heat stroke. When I was growing up, we would very rarely have days that were above 90, and when we did, there were always heat advisories put out saying to not go outside and play. And now there are regularly many days throughout the year that are over 100. Okay, now we have some art, and it's going to be expertly drawn. First, this is going to be our troposphere, and this is going to be our Earth. Now, let's label it troposphere, which is a subpart of the total atmosphere. Now, from the sun, we have energy that's incoming. The atmosphere will deflect some of it. It just won't make its way to the surface of the Earth. So some gets deflected. Some doesn't make it to the Earth's surface, where it's absorbed, and then it's re-emitted, and it goes back out into space. So overall, it's not contributing that much to the heating of the Earth. However, when we increase greenhouse gases, which we're going to represent here with these expertly drawn pollution clouds, is that energy from the sun hits the Earth, and when it radiates back out, instead of going out into space, it gets caught and trapped, and it stays in the Earth's atmosphere for longer before it reflects out. Think of your global warming like a blanket for the Earth. When you're cold, you put on a blanket, and the heat radiating out from your body is caught by the blanket, and it keeps you warm. The global warming, the greenhouse gases function like a blanket. They are necessary for life on Earth. However, these increased greenhouse gases are like extra blankets. That's no good, because when you get too hot, you can just burp the blanket, take it off of you, let some cold air in. We can't do that with the Earth's atmosphere. So one blanket is good, but as we increase greenhouse gases, we're adding a second or a third blanket, which means now we're going to catch even more of that energy from the sun. Now we're going to have some expertly drawn pictures. So our sources of greenhouse gases, we have methane, which comes from our landfills. This will be our trash. We'll call it MSW to sound fancy. And from there, you have anaerobic cellular respiration, which produces methane. It's a landfill, and this is methane. You have decomposition in wetlands. Those wetlands mean that there's going to be anaerobic respiration, which means methane is produced. Even though methane is not as common a greenhouse gas, it is a more powerful greenhouse gas when compared to carbon dioxide. Now, we're going to have Elon Musk's space car. Just imagine that this is on the Earth's surface. Dang, what an artist. This is going to be CO2 from cars. Remember that the most common method of generating electricity in the world is from consuming fossil fuels. So here we're going to have an expertly drawn power plant. Watch out, Bob Ross. I'm coming for you. And then finally, the big one. We don't have any space cows yet, so let's stick with land cows. Moo. And then they have methane both from their mouth and from their butts. Now, final fact. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we're going to stick with the Celsius scale because Celsius is better than Fahrenheit and much easier to spell. there's been between a 1 and a 1.5 degree increase in average temperature. Now that is average, which means some parts of the world are much higher, particularly at the poles. The poles are closer to 5+ degrees. That is your global warming. Next, we will have ozone depletion. So the causes of ozone depletion, a big one are aerosols. Think of things that come in cans that spray. Anything that's cold. Now, that's not including natural things that are cold like ice. This is talking about things like air conditioning or refrigerators. The production of styrofoam. The chemicals involved. Cfcs are the ones you'll hear about most commonly, but then there are also halons. The layer of the atmosphere, this is the stratosphere. There is ozone found in the troposphere, but that is tropospheric ozone, and it is not the ozone that's of concern in ozone depletion. Depleting tropospheric ozone would probably be a good thing. Stratospheric ozone is the good stuff. So depleting that is what's concerning, hence why it is the environmental problem. Now, the environmental effects. It damages plants, which decreases photosynthesis. We know that photosynthesis is the source of energy for all food webs. If you decrease photosynthesis, you've now decreased available energy in that ecosystem, which means your top-level predators are going to be the ones that have less energy available and more likely to leave or die. It damages plants. A big one is that it increases rates of skin cancer. It can cause blindness. And then, sort of like skin cancers, it increases rates of sunburns. Human health effects. There's going to be a bit of overlap with environmental effects. We have sunburns, skin cancer, cataracts that cause blindness, cataracts, and it can reduce your immune system's functionality. Now, again, we have our Earth. With global warming, the energy we're concerned with is infrared. With ozone depletion, we're concerned about ultraviolet, UV for short, ultraviolet. Now, the ultraviolet energy coming off of the sun comes towards Earth. Ultraviolet radiation is ionizing radiation. It's damaging to cells. So the ozone layer functions like a shield. And it blocks and absorbs a lot of that. It prevents it from reaching Earth's surface, which is where the living things are found. So this is our ozone shield. Now, it does not block everything. Some does get through, but just a little bit. Majority of it is blocked. It does not reach the Earth's surface. The problem with depleting the ozone layer is that it lets more of that ultraviolet radiation down to the Earth, and because it's ionizing, that means it can cause damage to living tissues. And then for our sources, a big one was hairspray in the 70s and 80s. So here we've got a dope big hair. We're gonna have our giant can of hairspray. expertly drawn refrigerator. We'll label it fridge just in case. Fridge. And then let's take a building, put our air conditioning units on top. Now, specifically to address ozone depletion, there was the Montreal Protocol of 1987. It was a ban in the production and use of CFCs worldwide. So why we care about ozone in the first place is that ozone is oxygen is naturally found in 3 forms in nature. You have O, O2, and O3. O is monatomic oxygen. If we sketch it out really roughly, it's just an oxygen molecule. Diatomic oxygen is the most common form that has 2 bonds. And ozone is 3 oxygen molecules. Now, in real chemistry, oxygen is diatomic, so you don't really find it in its own natural single form, but that's a separate thing. That's for your chemistry class. What's important is that the bonds in molecules absorb that ultraviolet radiation. Just regular oxygen has no bonds. It's useless. Sad face. O2 has 2 bonds, so it's not useless, but it's weak. Neutral face. Ozone, on the other hand, has a lot of bonds, which means it is really strong. It can absorb lots of ultraviolet radiation, which is why we like it. The majority of Earth's atmosphere, the oxygen found in Earth's atmosphere is diatomic oxygen, but it is not a very good absorber of ultraviolet radiation because it only has those 2 bonds. Now, with CFCs, that stands for chlorofluorocarbon, which means it is made of chlorine, fluorine, and carbon. In there, chlorine and fluorine are our bad guys. These are the ones that are no good. Give them an evil face. Give them an eye patch. And a beard. Grrr. He's mad. Those are the bad guys. Because chlorine and fluorine are both highly electronegative, they're both very reactive. Even though O3 has a lot of bonds, those bonds are not particularly strong. They're not as strong as they are in a regular oxygen molecule, which means when they absorb energy, they can break apart. Now, typically, when these bonds in O3 break, they will just find another oxygen molecule, atom, to bond with and recreate an ozone molecule. But chlorine and fluorine are both very electronegative and very reactive. So once these bonds break, when you have a loose oxygen atom, instead of rebonding to form O3, it will instead bond with chlorine or fluorine. College Board has asked that you be able to explain the process, the chemical formation of CFCs before, so we're going to go over the basic process right now. You have O3, and you introduce UV energy. And that gives you an O2 molecule plus a loose oxygen. CFCs are very weak, so CFCs plus ultraviolet energy break down into a chlorine ion, a fluorine ion, and then carbon. This chlorine will instantly snatch up that oxygen and create a chlorite ion. Now, chlorite itself is also attractive to loose molecules because it has a negative charge. So it will also further attract loose oxygens, which means that they cannot bond to other diatomic oxygen and reform ozone. Also, chlorite plus oxygen will go back and form chlorine and a regular diatomic oxygen molecule, which is not good at absorbing ultraviolet radiation. That's our neutral phase one. Also, you have now recreated this original chlorine ion, which will go, and you end up with chlorine plus ozone, will decompose ozone and create diatomic oxygen and another chlorine ion, which will then loop back and begin the entire process over again. So you're just stuck in this loop. That can happen up to 100,000 times per chlorine ion, which means every time you're creating one of these chlorine, this process can happen 100,000 times before chlorine will find something else to bond with and finally break that cycle. So even though CFCs were banned in 1987, there are still a lot of them up in the stratosphere breaking down ozone. So the ozone layer is recovering, but it is not recovered. It's not completely better yet. Also, the tropospheric ozone is going to have to work its way up into the stratosphere before it can decompose and break down. It is a very persistent compound, and it's going to take about 500 years for tropospheric ozone to work its way up. Finally, global warming and ozone depletion are not the same thing. They are very separate concepts. There is some overlap, in particular with the presence of CFCs, but they are completely separate issues. Global warming does not cause ozone depletion, and ozone depletion does not cause global warming.